In 2014, a small team at West Virginia University strapped portable sensors to the tailpipe of a Volkswagen diesel and drove it down a real American highway. On the lab bench, the car was clean. On the road, it wasn't. It was pouring out nitrogen oxides, by the US government's later account, up to 40 times the legal limit. The researchers weren't hunting for a scandal. They thought their equipment was broken. It wasn't. They had just found the thread that would unravel the largest fraud in the history of the auto industry. A piece of software Volkswagen called, internally, a way to pass the test. To understand the deception, you have to understand the promise. In the late 2000s, Volkswagen set out to conquer America with diesel. Diesel engines are efficient and torquey, but they have a chemistry problem. They run hot and lean, and that produces nitrogen oxides, NOx, the pollutants behind smog and respiratory harm. American emissions standards for NOx were among the strictest in the world. Volkswagen's pitch was that it had squared the circle. Its marketing called it clean diesel, cars that were fun to drive, cheap to fuel, and green enough to pass the toughest rules on Earth. It was, for a time, a cornerstone of the company's strategy to overtake Toyota as the world's largest automaker. According to the US Justice Department's later statement of facts, that promise was the problem. VW's own engineers, beginning around 2006, could not build an engine that met the strict NOx limits and satisfied American drivers at the same time. Faced with that wall, prosecutors say the engineers did not go back to their managers and admit the target was impossible. Instead, according to the Justice Department, they decided to make the car lie. The tool was a piece of software the regulators would come to call a defeat device. Here is how the Justice Department described its logic. An emissions test is highly standardized. The car sits on a set of rollers called a dynamometer and runs through a published, repeatable drive cycle. The software was written to recognize that exact pattern, the specific speeds, the timing, the fact that the steering wheel never turned. When it detected those telltale signs, it concluded the car was being tested. In that mode, the car ran clean. It turned its emissions controls up to full strength and slipped under the NOx limit. But the moment the software decided the car was on a real road, driven by a real person, it quietly turned those controls down. Performance and fuel economy improved, and the pollution the marketing had promised was gone came flooding back out of the tailpipe. According to the Justice Department, this was installed in VW, Audi, and Porsche-branded diesels, model year 2009 onward. It was not a one-time shortcut. Prosecutors say that around 2012, when hardware in some cars began to fail, engineers refined the cheat rather than abandon it, even adding a steering wheel angle recognition feature so the car could tell even faster whether a human was driving. The refinement was pushed out to cars already on the road, disguised, according to the Justice Department, as a routine software update for durability. The scale is what makes it staggering. By the government's count, roughly 590,000 vehicles in the United States carried this software, and around 11 million worldwide. In its 2019 civil complaint, the Securities and Exchange Commission alleged something further, that while this was going on, Volkswagen raised more than $13 billion from American bond investors, at a time when, the SEC says, senior executives already knew hundreds of thousands of US cars. were breaking the law. Volkswagen and its former chief executive have contested aspects of these claims. Those securities allegations are civil, not proven criminal findings. The unraveling began, as it often does, with outsiders who had no idea what they'd found. In 2014, the International Council on Clean Transportation commissioned that West Virginia University study, expecting, if anything, to show how clean modern diesels had become. Instead, they found the on-road numbers that made no sense. They handed the results to regulators, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and the California Air Resources Board. What followed, according to the Justice Department, was more than 18 months of stonewalling. Regulators asked increasingly pointed questions. VW, prosecutors say, offered technical excuses, innocent mechanical explanations, while concealing the real cause, the software sitting in every one of those cars. California kept testing. The answers kept not adding up. Finally, regulators delivered an ultimatum. Without a credible explanation, they would not certify Volkswagen's 2016 diesels for sale. On September 18, 2015, the EPA issued a public notice of violation of the Clean Air Act. This time, cornered Volkswagen admitted it. The cars contained a defeat device. The reaction was immediate. Billions in market value evaporated. And on September 23, 5 days later, Chief Executive Martin Winterkorn resigned. He said he was not aware of any wrongdoing on his part and accepted responsibility for the company. That distinction, responsibility without admitted personal knowledge, would define the legal fights still running today. The American reckoning was severe and unusually concrete. In 2016, Volkswagen agreed to a civil settlement worth up to $14.7 billion, buying back or fixing cars and funding environmental cleanup. Then, in January 2017, the company pleaded guilty to 3 felonies: conspiracy, obstruction of justice for destroying documents, and importing cars by false statements. It paid a further $4.3 billion in criminal and civil penalties and accepted 3 years of probation under an independent monitor. Counting settlements, buybacks and fines, the scandal is widely reported to have cost Volkswagen more than $30 billion, the most expensive scandal in the industry's history. Then came the people. In the United States, engineer James Liang cooperated and was sentenced to 40 months in prison. Oliver Schmidt, a VW emissions executive arrested while on holiday in Florida, was sentenced to 7 years. 6 VW figures in total were indicted in Michigan in 2017, but most, including the former CEO, live in Germany, which generally does not extradite its citizens, and so the US charges against them remain unresolved here. Germany ran its own cases. In May 2025, a court in Braunschweig convicted 4 former managers of fraud. The most senior, engine development chief Jens Hadler, was sentenced to 4.5 years in prison. And then there is Martin Winterkorn himself. German prosecutors charged the former CEO with fraud, giving false testimony and market manipulation. He denies all of it. His trial opened in September 2024 and then stalled, postponed again and again on grounds of his ill health. As of August 2026, that trial is suspended and no verdict has been reached. On the question of what the man at the very top knew and when, the court record is, for now, unfinished. Dieselgate is often told as a story about software. It is really a story about incentives. A target was set that engineering could not honestly meet. Rather than move the target, the record shows people chose to fake the result and then defend the fake. for years against regulators doing exactly what regulators are supposed to do. What finally caught it was not an insider and not a watchdog agency's routine audit. It was a few academics with portable sensors and no stake in the outcome, comparing what a company said against what a tailpipe actually did. The gap between the lab and the road turned out to be the whole story. It usually is. Volkswagen's US penalties are settled. But nearly a decade on, cases are still moving through German courts, and the question of individual accountability at the top remains, in part, unanswered. If you want to know whether a system really works, don't watch what it promises. Watch what comes out the back. If this kind of investigation is what you're here for, subscribe. Next time, we follow a different paper trail. Until then, follow the money.